Okay, so I've just uploaded a new walkthrough for us. This is the Forms with Own API. So Forms with Own API, well, the backend is built by Anhar, thank you very much. So what we're going to be doing is looking at the full stack today. So today we'll be starting with, we've got our backend working already. Thanks everyone for downloading and getting that working. And then we'll be now building on the front end using React. So when you do a git clone, the folder will be named after the repo. So you should have a folder called Books Backend MERN on your hard drive. So I normally put all my things in groups of folders to do with whatever I'm working on. So let's have a look. Okay, so here you can see CA, Coder Academy, MERN. That's my folder structure. So in this MERN folder, all my MERN projects are here. So with the MERN projects, it means I can have the back end and the front ends in the same folder. I like to keep the back end and the front ends in the same folder so you know where things are. I've got my database running in another terminal window and Mongo running in another terminal window there. So what? Yep.
So we should run npx, the React app, within the Books Backend MERN folder?
No.
No. Okay.
So you'll have a root folder where all the projects are.
Yeah.
In that folder, there'll be a subfolder for the back end and a subfolder for the front end.
Right.
So in my case, I've called my folder MERN, where all my MERN projects are. From there, that's where I did the git clone to create the back end.
Yeah.
So I've got that here. And so now I'm going to create the front end.
Okay, cool.
Oh, so you have front end, back end, like in your MERN folder, you have lots of different front end files.
So yeah, so in my MERN folder, I will have front end and back ends together. And in other places on my hard drive, I've got, yeah, the pairs of back end and front ends together. So I've just copied over the npx command. How's yours going, Ivan?
Still going.
What? Okay, so Ivan kicked his off a few minutes early, so to make sure we have time. So cd books. Need to spell it right. Maybe just 2 O's. I had to type front end because I've also got books back end there. So just changing to the front end. So now I'm just installing the Node packages. Yeah, we'll be able to fast forward this.
Fast forward.
So the Node packages are installing in the background. So what I'm going to do now is just copy over our app.js. So with the app.js, I've just removed, sorry, but I've removed the spinning logo this time. Alright, so I've just pasted over the code. If you don't leave you need an export default. So if you paste over the code, you'll notice that I was missing the export default app. So we just need to make sure that we have that there. So let
the repo from the other day, right? The API. Controlling. So we didn't lifecycle for the API.
What are you talking about?
Code you're copying over.
Yep. So on Jolly, I've just updated, and there's a new thing called Forms with Own API. So that's one we're working off this morning. So Forms with Own API uses the own backend that we've created through Express. Okay, as Josh pointed out, I had a lot of windows open. I had something running in the background, so I got a port conflict error. So I've gone over and stopped that, and now I should be able to start and run the front end. Sorry? All right, so it says book 0. Why does it say book 0? Because we haven't seeded?
Oh, because you haven't actually
Yeah. Yeah, so a couple of reasons there. Because we haven't actually, although I've got a book state variable, I'm not doing anything with it. So I'm initializing the array to be an empty array. So when I try to see what the length is, it's going to be 0. So we want to load the books API. Now we're using componentDidMount here because that's that lifecycle event that occurs once as the component starts up. So that's a great spot to actually hit the API and load stuff. Now here we're just using a fetch command. We've seen these over and over again. So this is just a standard fetch command where we're pulling out the data. Ah, damn. Now I've just pasted these in here. There may actually be coding conventions about where you locate these files in your React files. So where I've worked, we've often kept lifecycle methods all together, load methods all together and things like that. So we are going to be adding a fair bit of code into this app.js today. It'd be a good idea just to think about what you're adding where to make sure it's a little bit easier to find later. I also really liked what Anha did where she had the little pluses so it was minimized. I think that's another good way. Once you've got a few things in here, maybe it's a good idea to do that so you can look around and find things. Now I've accidentally left a variable from later on that we're not using yet, so I'm going to delete that. Actually, I don't think it's going to cause an error. Let's just see. Books 20. What does everyone else get? You got 7?
7.
So I'm just going to reseed my database.
Yeah, it's like not winning.
So if you haven't run seed yet, you will get 0. To run seed, you just go to localhost 5000 because that's where we've got our backend, and just do /seed. Does anybody still have 0? Okay, and how's this going to help Josh? Cool. All right, so what we've got next is we're going to actually populate the list. Now, we've done this a few times. I'm just using the map again. So over here, I'm just going to replace the render with the render and the book list method. Now, as I said, we're going to be adding a fair bit of code, so that's why I've chosen to make the book list a separate method. What's going to happen in render is going to get pretty full on. There's going to be a few things happening, so anything we can do to make it look a bit simpler and easier to understand is going to be a good thing. So I've already refactored, pre-refactored, okay, whatever. I've chosen to put the book list out into a separate method. So I could have done that later as a refactor, but I know that we're going to be adding a few things, so I've done it now. So book list is just a method, a helper method that we've got in our app.js component. So a lot of the methods we've been creating have been either lifecycle methods or event handlers. You can create as many helper methods that you want in your app, in your component. So in this case, this method's going to help us with rendering. We also created this load book method, which is going to help us with loading so that we can call it in multiple places if we want to later. All right, so book list is going to loop through all the books and display. Did Josh just got it working? Great. All right, isn't that beautiful? Look, Hey, but there's a red message. Why is there a red message? Keys? Always the keys? Yeah, I might have done this before, leaving out the key. Oh, look, there's a space already near the div. So where am I going to put the key? Should I put the key? Yeah, it has to be on the div. It has to be on the outside thing. So it's going to be key. And what would be a good thing for key? We use name. All right, I'm going to use index. So index we know will be unique in this list. So let's just have a look. And it's re-rendered without an error. All right, some funny names here. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to be able to add books. So we're going to have to add some stuff into our app component. So when we click, we can have like a button so we can click for add. So if we do have a button, we're going to need a handler for the button. We're going to need a variable for state so we can know when we're in adding mode. And we're also going to need a form so for when we're adding. So let's get started. We're going to first add an on-click event, a button with an on-click event. So we're going to call it handle click. As we said, that was the naming convention that we use for click events. So now we have a button, and when I click add, nothing much happens. It just reruns render. So it's rerunning render because we're calling set state. So I'm actually going to add the variable into state now. Actually, when I refresh the page, can you guys see that it displays as a 0? Why would it be displaying 0? So you reset the state?
And then that's why it's 0 by default. And then after we follow the data from the API, it's setting the state or refresh it.
Yeah. So it's resetting the state. So as you reload the page, it's creating it's reloading, remounting the component. So its state be initialized as an empty array, which will make on the first render, it's going to be rendering with a length of 0. Then it's going to call our load books. Now in our case, the load books is really fast because it's local, but when it's remote, it might be a bit slower. So I've actually set as a challenge to actually have a loading message there. So that will be part of the challenges for later. And this is something to be aware of too when you're building these things, because they're local, they're crazy fast, and you think your app's really fast, and then you put it somewhere else and it might not be. So you've got to remember those scenarios. So now we've got an adding flag. We're going to use this as a conditional like we did previously. When we're in adding mode, we'll display the form. When we're not in adding mode, we'll display the book list. So I'm just going to update render with that code now. Okay, so we've got some clues here, but what do you guys think will happen when I try to run this? Yeah, undefined. Okay, so I've created this as like a separate, the next step. So we're kind of like trying to take baby steps, implementing this, addressing a couple different issues at a time. So the next issue here, the next thing we want to address is we want to set up the form. So we're going to create a couple files. We're going to create a book form file for the CSS and for the HTML. So this is actually the basic styling I used in the previous example, the wishlist example. Now when I create these components, I'm going to be using the convention of the components folder again.
Do you have many components? Like you have a lot of components, you put another folder on that.
Yep. So yeah, definitely. So Jing is just asking if we had many components, would we create other folders? And for sure. So
Do you follow the convention of separating components into like smart dumb components, or like containers and components and stuff like that?
yep. So Josh is just asking about smart and dumb components. So I'm actually keeping what I think is all the smart components, all the smarts in app.js at the moment. So the way we're building this, all the smarts are going to be in app.js, and book form is going to be what I call a dumb component. It's just going to be the guy that just does things and we send it back. So what we might do is if we were adding more things to this, we might actually add separate layers. So all of the smarts that help run the book form run, we might put into a separate area. Sorry, I can't think of a quick example, but just say we were going to have books and wishes in our app. That doesn't make sense, but anyway, we would have like a wish page, and the wish page would have the wish form as a subcomponent on that page. So as Jing was saying, we would have separate component folders. Under components, we would have folders for groups of components that work together. So once we get a lot of components in an application, we would create separate folders to group those folders together. So for instance, in our current situation, we've only got 2 components, but in our current situation, the app is the only one that uses the book form component. So I could keep those 2 together in a folder underneath components if I had two components were the only ones that work together. So it's like a component that's a helper. But sometimes we might create a component that actually is used by in multiple places, say like notifications. So we built notifications as a part of an earlier challenge. That's going to be used potentially across multiple forms. So we might create a shared folder under components, and in that shared folder we would put things like notifications and other components that are used across multiple components. So good questions. Thanks for that, guys.
What is smart and dumb?
What is smart and dumb? Okay, so yeah, okay, that's a bit subjective. But
Examples, please.
but yeah, so it is a bit subjective, and it is kind of, but like here, in the parent component, this is where we're talking to the API. So we might at the moment we've only got book form, but we might have a couple different forms that use the book data. So this smart component, the parent component that then fires off the book form, maybe we have an author's form as well later on. We might have an author form, a genre form, a couple of other forms. That would be the smart component at the top, loads the data from the API, but then fires off what I'm calling dumb components that just kind of get the data and pass it back to the parent component, which has got the smarts to go into and from the database. So instead of the author form talking back to the database when it saves things, and the book form talking back to the database when it saves things, it's only saved in one place. So it'll be the app component or whatever equivalent if we restructure, that will be the only one place where we talk to and from the database. That makes sense? So at the moment we've just got one form, it's pretty simple, but yeah, once you start adding more forms, you don't want to reproduce things like loading from the database. So the style is to keep it up in the parent, so the parent fires off those forms and all that stuff's located in one spot.
The way I think about it is smart components tell other components what to render.
Yep.
And dumb components have to be told what to render.
Okay, that was really good. So yeah, so Josh, I don't know if the voice picked it up. So yeah. All right.
You can't be a dumb.
So yeah, so smart components get told what to render, and dumb components get told what to render, and smart components work out what needs to be rendered. That's a good way to summarize it. Thanks very much. Okay, so what we've done is we've just popped in some CSS, and now we're going to be building the form. Now, I've actually got a whole bunch of code here already because we've gone through this already yesterday. So with this code, I'm initializing all the data attributes on our book. So the data attributes on our book are going to be displayed in our form. Wade went through this example earlier today as well. With the sample solutions, we've got one handle change event, and this one handle change event is handling the change for all of the different inputs, and it's using this technique with the square brackets on the ID. So we have to make sure that our IDs all have names that match the data attributes we want.
Before we move on, what is stop like? I think that examples.
Yeah. So if I don't use this fat arrow here, I would have to use a bind. So I'm using this ES6 notation here with a fat arrow, which implicitly adds a bind. So it will implicitly add handle change to the instance. So that's happening automatically there. If you don't do that, you have to either bind, as you call it. Another place people do binding is they will set up all their bindings in the constructor. So you might have seen an example where that was done. So I've worked on projects where that was a convention, all the bindings were done there. And it depends with Babel that's automatically converting ES6 for us, we can just use this notation.
It makes this available. So you don't have it, it doesn't know what this is.
It thinks this is inside the function.
Say that again, Ivan?
It thinks that this is inside the function as opposed to, doesn't it? If you don't use ES6, it thinks that this .set state is within handle change as opposed to
Yeah.
the actual.
So it thinks that this props is something specific to this function. It doesn't understand that this is specific to this instance of the class. Yeah. Cool. Okay, this props is a technique that we used last time. We haven't added it on the other on the app yet, so we haven't passed it down. But that's fine for now, so I won't give us an error. Okay, so we're still getting errors because it's not defined, because we haven't actually added it to the app. Oh yeah, and I didn't export. Cool.
That looks like a killer, that one, that export default looks like it's a killer always.
Yep, got to remember it.
Always around.
Okay, so it's saying the book form's not defined, so what's a way that we can get that to work? Import it into app.js? Yeah.
Still, it's still good.
That.
Sorry, wait. Dot dash?
Yeah. No, almost one.
One dot?
Yeah.
Yeah, one dot. Cool. All right, so we don't have an error anymore. Cool. And now if I click add. Oh, that looks awful. Why does that look awful? It's not saved. Is that going to do it? Boom. Cool. Okay, so we don't actually have a handler for cancel. But what happens if we click cancel? Could you read ahead? Okay. Yeah, so it's going to do the default action for the button, as Ivan said. So here, if I hit add, the default action for clicking a button is to re-render the page. So it kind of feels like cancel's working, right? But we don't actually like refreshes. We're working with React. We don't have to have full refreshes. So I've actually left it as a challenge to implement that cancel button. So how would you implement the cancel button? You would want to so with the save button, we want to pass the object back, but with the cancel button, you would do something a bit different. Anybody got any ideas how you might implement a cancel button?
Adding false.
Yeah, you want to set adding false. So you can find a way to set adding false. That's a good idea. So in our book form, our handle click is using props to call back to the app.js to pass back the data that we read. So we now have to add that to our app.js. So inside app.js, we're going to add a handler for that, and we're going to pass that method as props to our book form. So here, we're passing it as a method. We're passing it like it's a variable. We're not invoking it, so there's no parentheses. So at the moment, we're setting the state and we're showing console log the new book that came through. So let's just test it and see if it's all working. That's from when I was playing with movies a while ago. So here, I'm just going to hit, we could see in my render from the book form, we could see as I'm typing, things will be changing. So that's the on change method, the render. So now when I hit save, it's actually passed the data back, but it's not doing anything. So when we hit save, it's passed it back and it's changed the adding state. So the form's no longer displayed, but the list is. So to be able to add a book, we're going to be maintaining the ID. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. I think Wade found a really good technique where, what was it, Lodash?
Yeah, unique ID.
Yeah, so Lodash will generate a unique ID for you. So that's a really good, it could be a really good strategy. So what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a new ID that's one more than the last one. So it kind of has a lot of assumptions, like we're not going to delete, we're not going to reorder. So this is a pretty fragile thing, but because we don't have delete, it's going to be safe for now. So let's see how that works. So now it's generated an ID for us. And we can see the IDs we have are currently up to 7, so the new ID is 7, so that's a safe one we'll be able to save. So what I'm going to do is actually call a method called createBook, and that will do the saving for us. Okay, so I didn't actually implement that yet, so there's an error. So we need to implement it. Now what I'm doing here is I'm reusing load books. So inside load books is where we were setting the state. So instead of setting the state in multiple places, because when we did the lifecycle thing, if you set state in multiple places, it can get crazy and things can crash. So I wanted to have the one spot where we set the state. So what's happening here is we're using a post method to push the data down to our API endpoint. Now I've looked this up and there's an API endpoint called newBook, which is quite nice. It makes sense for what we want to do. And then once we've got a positive response back, that's when we can reload the books. Now in this case, saving the books isn't doing anything. But what could happen is the backend could do some reformatting. It might do some language changes, locale changes or something. It might add some extra value. So we're actually going to push the data back and then reload it from the database. So this create method, I want to keep these methods together where we're calling the API. So I'm going to put it right next to the load books. And the load books is going to set the adding to false, and once the adding's false, the form will disappear. And we can see we generated the ID 8, and it's coming back from the server with 8. Cool, big tick, adding done. So what we're going to look at now is editing books.
Easy.
So for editing, we're going to use the technique where we click on the actual thing we edit. So I'm going to be updating the book list. So the book list will now have an on-click event on each item. And we're doing it on the outside div. Actually, I think I worked with Cooper on trying to do this with a Pokemon in vanilla JavaScript, and it was really painful, wasn't it?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is actually a really nice way to add the on-click event to the outside, and even it's like a div, so it will just handle, because we had trouble trying to get which component within the thing to select, so. So I'm just going to regroup this and put my handle click event next to my edit event, so the handlers are next to one another. So when I click, I can see that what I've clicked is being displayed in the console. So the click event is wired up, and that's all working. So I wanted to create a flag to say that when we're editing a book, and so I've called it selected book. I'm not sure if I'm happy with that name. Does anyone think of a better name? What would you call that when you're editing the book? So when we're adding, we've got true or false, but when we're selecting the book, edit? Editing?
Says this.
Edit selected book.
Oh, that would probably be a bit clearer. Yep. So yeah, so something like edit selected book, and this is the kind of thing that happens as well, is you could pick a variable and start working with the code, and then if it doesn't quite fit with how you're going to use it, it's just name it to fit it better. So I've just chosen a name that's kind of okay at the moment to get us going, but if you want to go back and choose a better name that fits a bit better to the functionality you end up building, that's a good approach. So we want to conditionally display be either in edit mode or in adding mode. So what I've got here is the existing adding, and I've added, as we saw in when we first introduced JSX, we saw that we could nest ternary operators. So in this case, I'm nesting it so that it's either, if it's adding, it'll display the form. If it's not adding, it will check to see if it's selecting, and if it is selecting, it will display the form with all of the book data. So I'm passing through all of the book data fields.
What's the most ternary operator nesting?
That's a personal question.
How deep have you gone?
So how deep? I think this is probably on the edge, because I think the readability here is okay, but yeah. So this is another styling convention, is once you get a few different fields, a few different attributes, you start go multi-line. So here I've gone multi-line. Another coding convention is often a limit of 80 characters, so that's why I don't like to scroll over to the right. It's nice to see it all on the one screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Cooper's just asking if we want to put this in a component ourselves. Actually, one of the steps in the challenge, I've actually suggested we just pass a book along instead of passing all the separate attributes. So that's something to do for the challenge. But here I just want to be really clear that we're passing over all of the fields. So if we're passing all this data in, we want to do something with it on the form side. So now part of getting editing books working, we're going to switch over and look at the book form. And what we're going to do is actually read in props for all the fields. Can someone explain why I'm using an OR here? What does that do? Yeah, so if this is empty, it'll put an empty string. So if this is undefined, that'll be false, and it will do the empty string. So it's just a shorthand notation to put stuff in. So let's see if it's working. So I click one of these. So what I've done here is I click book 4, and I can see the book 4's come through, but it's not being displayed. So those props are there, but we aren't actually putting the props into the fields yet. So we have to put the props into the fields, and actually Wade showed us that attribute this morning when he went through his example. Remember the attribute you used in the select thing?
Yeah.
It was the value attribute. So we can initialize the value. Now once I started adding that value attribute, everything started running off the screen, so I decided to go multi-line with this, which means that our render method is now a lot longer than it was. So you can see here it was already off the screen a little bit, so what I've chosen to do is go multi-line. So now that we've added this extra attribute for value, so all the other attributes have stayed the same. All I've done here is just add the value attribute to each input. So let's see if that's working. Oh.
Or just missing a parentheses or something.
Missing a parentheses. So when I copied over the render, I went down and accidentally removed the closing quote for the class. Cool. Alright, so I'm going to click on, boom, all the values is being displayed. Cool. So all the values are being displayed, but we're not passing all the values back. We need to pass the ID back as well. So because we're editing, the ID is going to tell us whether it's an edited component which already has an ID or a new component which doesn't have an ID. So this is a strategy for reusing forms, is by identifying the ID to see whether it's being reused.
Is that because IDs are getting added? Oh, that's right. They get added after you click save on the form.
Yeah. So I've just updated the handle click method, and the only thing different was this ID here. So we're making sure we pass through the ID. It'll either be empty when we're creating a new one, or it will have a value when we're editing. So updating is different. Updating, when we're talking to the back end, we actually have a separate endpoint that we're going to be talking to on the back end. So we're going to create a method to handle that for us. And because we've reorganized, because we've got the code structured so that we can load after we do the update, we can use that code again here as well.
You had this before, but can you explain the headers you're using? Why are you using like insert stuff like that? Does that mean you can only allow JSON?
Yeah. It's to be really explicit about handling JSON. So we want to make sure that MongoDB understands what we're saying.
So you need to set content type and set extent.
I think it's because of the fetch API, right? If you use the Axios, you probably wouldn't have to.
Yeah, does that.
Yeah. True. Thanks.
So I've just popped in the update book near where the other API calls. But we're not calling it yet, so we need to call it somewhere. So we're going to call it inside our add new book handler. So in this add new book handler, we're going to check and see if there is an ID. If there is an ID, then we'll update the book. Otherwise, we will create an ID and call create book. So currently the add new book handler just caters for the new case. It just automatically tries to create a new ID. So what we're going to do is pop this updated code in, and it will check to see if it needs to create a new ID or not. So we need to make sure that once we're finished loading, we reset all of our flags, because at the end of loading, we won't be adding and we won't be editing. So we need to make sure we reset all the flags. All right, so let's just see that working. So I'm going to edit the last one and make it 22 and save. Boom, it's updated. Cool. And as soon as I click on it, it comes back to the edit screen. So if I want to add a new book now,
We don't have the price because in the create I didn't use this structure. I didn't put price, so we'll have to edit that. Sorry.
all right, so Anna's just recognized that she's actually got a bug on her back end. So I actually fixed it in my local copy. Sorry. So, all right, so a couple things there. So let's go see if I've got it open. That would be a no. Great. Ah. So looking at the back end, all right, I was trying to look at the change. Is it not displaying? Oh, here. So Anna had written code to assign the ID, title, and author, and I had to add price. So you guys will need to do that locally as well. So if you guys have added, is it adding? Where are we? What endpoint? We're at create a new book. So when you create a new book, you guys, the price won't come through until you make that change in the back end. So you'll need to make that change in the back end locally and just restart the server. So
all you did was add price, right?
yeah. So all I did was add price. So here we're destructuring price out of the request, and then here we need to put price in when we're creating book create. All right, so I want to kick off the challenge now. So if you haven't got this working, we can help you with that. But the challenge has got a whole bunch of things that I've mentioned on the way through, as well as a couple of different enhancements. So at the moment, the form is being reused, and it says, so here it just says book form. So what we can do to make it clearer is when we're editing, say edit book, or when we're creating, say create book. Now this pattern of reusing a form for create and new is really common, so it's a good one, it's a good technique to build. Also, depending on whether we're creating or editing, it always says save, so you can actually change that using conditionals as well. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of refactoring we can do. So we've called it new book handler. Maybe we want to say update and create, or something that's a bit more obvious, because we're using that new book handler now for editing as well. All right, so there is actually a whole lot of challenges here. So the idea here would be is that you guys will start working on these challenges, and we don't actually have another lesson scheduled for this afternoon, but we've got a lot of challenges from this morning and a couple challenges from the previous days that people haven't caught up with. So what I was thinking today is that people would use today as to catch up on the challenges. So work on the challenges from this morning, today, and ones that have left over. So let us know if you've got any questions. Thanks, everybody.
I love the way class.